Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. When I was writing this talk and doing a little research online regarding some of the studies on happiness, I came across this great line. Money doesn't buy you happiness, but it can buy a jet ski. Have you ever seen a sad person on a jet ski? I always judged jet skis terribly until one time I was a speaker on a cruise, and they broke out the jet skis, and what fun! You cannot everyone else is miserable with the sound, but while you're on it, woohoo! There's a story that Tony Robbins tells. He was giving a seminar on kind of success and happiness, and he asked people to raise their hand whether they felt happy or successful. And some raised their hands and some didn't. And he went over to someone who didn't raise his hand. And he said, I noticed you didn't raise your hand. Can I ask you a few questions? The guy said, sure. He said, how much money did you make last year? And the guy said, about 1.4 million. He said, you have kids? He goes, yeah, I have 2 kids. They're in Ivy League schools. And he said, you work out? He said, yeah, I run about 3 marathons a year. And Tony Robbins said, but you didn't raise your hand. The guy said, no, well, the truth is I play golf with some guys who make more money than I do. And one of my kids is in school, but he's majoring in English. I think he's wasting his time. And my body fat is still 0.2% off my goal. So Tony thanked him. He went over to someone who did raise his hand. And he said, so I see you with your hand up. Can I ask you some questions? The guy said, sure. He goes, how much money did you make last year? He said, about $42,000. I drive a bus. He said, you have kids? He goes, yeah, 2 kids, great kids. And do you work out? He goes, no. He said, but you raised your hand that you were happy and successful. Why? And the guy said, look, where I come from, every day above ground is a good day. And that says a lot about happiness and how subjective happiness can be. So is happiness something we can make happen? Or is happiness something that arises when we remove the blocks to happiness? And you could say through this lens of Buddhist psychology that in the absence of 3 basic forces, in the absence of greed, and in the absence of hatred, and in the absence of delusion, when those are cleared away, there's a natural quality of presence that arises that we could say has some qualities of happiness. So there are 4 elements I'd like to explore a little bit tonight. The first is the importance of identifying the source of unhappiness. The second is to really look at the 2 ways that happiness emerges. Some suggestions and guidelines on how to cultivate and increase your capacity for happiness. And a little bit on kind of the karma of a happy thought. What happens in your life when you consciously cultivate more happiness? So again, when we look through this lens of Buddhist psychology, and we look at the Buddha's life, when he was visited by the four heavenly messengers, when he was experienced and saw sickness, when he saw old age, when he saw death, and when he encountered a renunciate, he ran across someone who had nothing, and yet this man was radiantly happy. He thought, how could that be, that someone who owned so little could have such an inner radiance? And that set him on his path. He wanted to know, what is it that's beyond sickness, old age, and death? And what is the key to suffering? Can we identify the source of suffering? Because if we can identify the source of suffering, then maybe something will arise out of that. So there's a classic story, and it goes on and on. I'll shorten it for you. I've shared it before, but it's a story of a young man who wanted to please the court, and he was a bit of a fool, so they just wanted to get rid of him. And they sent him off on a quest. They said, your goal is to find what can make a happy person sad and a sad person happy. And with great intensity, he took off. Years and years and years, he asked people, what can make a happy person sad and a sad person happy? No one could respond. So after years and years on this quest to find the answer to that, he was apparently this not such a young man now, was in a bazaar, and he asked this old jeweler, can you tell me what would make a happy person sad and a sad person happy? And this old jeweler smiled. He told him to wait. And he went to the back of his tent, and he came back, and he handed him a ring. And inscribed inside the ring were the words, "This too shall pass." Our suffering is directly related to our experience of change. If something in your life is changing and you don't want it to, or if it isn't changing and you want it to the degree you are resisting that, you will suffer. And so it becomes a question of fighting with reality, in which case you'll probably lose, or embracing what it means to cooperate with reality. So it's an interesting thing to reflect on. And if you like, we'll do just a short reflection. You can close your eyes. You might just connect with the breath and just take a few moments to reflect on what is changing in your life right now. What's falling away? What's calling you forward? And if you would, bring into mind one thing that's between you and feeling happy in your life. If you're visual, you might see it. If you're auditory, you might hear the words or recall some sounds associated with it. You might explore what it's like to feel that inside. And if you would, just say hello to it. Let it know you see it. And imagine you could place the concern for it to the side. And then again, if you can think of something else that's between you and feeling happy right now. And in your own way, let it know you see it. And imagine you could place the concern for that to the side. And then once again, what's one more thing in your life that's between you and feeling happy? And let it know you see it. And imagine you could place the concern for that to the side and just take a moment to acknowledge these just 3 things that you have called that are between you and feeling happy. And you might also imagine just sort of the landscape of your life, the issues in your life that are between you and feeling happy. And we'll come back a little later to revisit some of these. If you like, you can deepen the breath and you can let your eyes open. I find that reflection to be very, very helpful. That when you can really pause and just identify what's between you and feeling happy, what's between you and feeling free, it begins to just sort of identify the landscape. But it also identifies who you are as the observer rather than being quite so identified. And that can begin to open up some new possibilities. But basically, anything that isn't going in the direction you want it to is a source of suffering. And the resistance to what's happening amplifies your suffering or your stress. When the Buddha had his moment of awakening, one of the first realizations he reportedly had was a recognition of how everyone is looking for happiness in exactly the wrong way. That we are conditioned to look for happiness through the externals, when in fact the real work is internal, the attitude in the mind, refining consciousness itself. So there's a beautiful description of the 8 worldly winds. As you're trying to walk this tightrope of life, these particular winds that blow you off center. So these are some of the things that set you up for unhappiness. And I'll just read the list. Taking unhealthy delight in money and material possessions. Being upset if you don't have enough possessions or afraid you'll lose what you have. Taking unhealthy delight in praise and being upset and dejected when you're criticized. Taking unhealthy delight in having a good reputation and an image in the world. And being upset and dejected when you have a bad reputation or you look bad to others. And taking unhealthy delight in experiencing sense pleasures and being upset and dejected with unpleasant sensations. So we're driven by certain desires. We have desires to have nice things. We have desires to be well known and well liked. We have desires to have a good reputation in the world, and we have fears as well. The fear of not having enough, the fear of losing, the fear of shame and criticism. They all have to do with attachment. It's always helpful to recall the 4 noble truths, the 4 cornerstones of Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy. The fact that stress and suffering occur for everyone. The fact that there is a cause for your stress and suffering that has to do with attachment, with identification. The third being the fact that it's possible to let go. And the fourth, that there's a path, there are practices, techniques, there are technologies that can help you to let go of where you're attached and increase your capacity for happiness and joy and equanimity. I was listening to a talk by Matthew Ricard, who is kind of a specialist in happiness. They've done lots of studies on the brain, and so far he's the happiest man in the world from all their tests. And he started off one of his talks, and he said, no one wakes up in the morning and thinks to themselves, I hope this day is filled with suffering. We all have an inherent desire to be happy. It's sort of built in, a natural desire to want to feel good. And the question is, how do we cultivate happiness? I led a day-long retreat on Saturday, and I really don't follow any sports. I only follow one team, which is the New England Patriots. And so on Sunday afternoon, I had this window. I thought, because I don't have a television, I'm going to go out and watch the Patriots game. So as I was, I had my laptop. I was like dinking around with a talk. And I got a call from one of my best friends, Michael, who was here. I interviewed him a little while back. So we're chatting back and forth. He said, "So where are you? What's going on?" I said, "Well, I'm in this bar, and I had this vegan burrito in front of me, and a great beer, and the Patriots are winning, 31-17, and they just showed a shot of Rex Ryan really upset. I am really happy right now." And I realized the externals in my life were completely dialed in. I was watching a game. My team was winning. Great food, great beer, talking to one of my best friends in the world. Fantastic. Then it occurred to me, would it be possible to be happy if they were losing? And that's really what the question is all about. If you ever watched, I love to watch people watching sports because it's so up and down. Once a friend invited me to one of the Redskins games here in town, and just to watch people, how like someone catches a pass, it's the best thing in the world. Someone drops a pass, oh, it's crushing. The up and down. And of course, it's so exaggerated in watching a sports game. But basically, it's such a wonderful mirror, because if your happiness is dependent on outside conditions, your mind will be like a yo-yo. It'll just go up and down in constant reaction. And of course, kind of an unexamined life, all we are doing is reacting. We are reacting to unpleasant, trying to nuke it and make it go away. We're reacting to pleasant, trying to hold on and amplify it and make sure it stays. So one form of happiness is dependent on external conditions. Another form of happiness is not dependent on external conditions. And it becomes a question of how is it that you can cultivate your capacity to be happy no matter what is happening outside. Desire is a really interesting thing. Back in the ashram, this was many years ago, one of the brothers was telling me how we had two separate ashrams. He was driving from one to the other, and he bought a big bag of chocolate chip cookies, and he was going to have a few and then share them with his friends when he got to the other facility. And he said these, they just smelled so good. He said, like, that first chocolate chip cookie it was so delicious. The second chocolate chip cookie was pretty good. The third chocolate chip cookie was okay. The sixth chocolate chip cookie was disgusting. He finally pulled over and he put it in the trunk because he knew he couldn't control it anymore. So happiness dependent on externals is a setup, inevitably. So, of course, the question becomes, is it possible to cultivate a sense of internal happiness, no matter what the externals? It's really easy to talk about, but it's not so easy to actually practice. So, some of the practices that can cultivate happiness. There's a great happiness study, and thank you, Ray, for sending it along. This is an article from Scientific American, and the title is called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy One." And it's a really interesting study because they really wanted to find out, well, what are the keys to being more content in your life? And what they found out is that for most people, a large fraction of your thoughts, almost half of your thoughts, have nothing to do with what you're actually doing in the moment. It's hard to study happiness because it's very subjective, of course. But they came up with a really cool way of getting some real useful information in a pretty unconventional way. What they did is they interrupted people at different times of the day, and they asked them what they're doing, and what was on their mind, and to kind of rate their level of happiness. And because they did this many times during the day, over many, many days, they started to gather a lot of information that they could look at. So they developed an iPhone app, and it periodically would survey people. What are you doing? And what are you thinking? And how happy are you? What they noticed was that people who were on a task, but they weren't really thinking about the task, they were pretty dissatisfied. But if there was something they were doing and they were actually thinking about it and engaged into it, the happiness quotient went up quite a bit. So it pretty clearly showed that we're happiest when we're thinking about what we're doing. Or you could say, when you're fully engaged in the moment, your happiness goes up. I remember I taught film criticism for 1 year. And the days when I'd be showing a film, I'd think, oh, this is going to be a great day. I just have, I can just sit back. And those days were excruciating. But the days when I had like a full, intense teaching load, those days flew by, a real sense of satisfaction. So there's something here about being focused and being fully present in your experience that's very, very satisfying. If you're familiar with the flow state, Csikszentmihalyi, probably butchering his name, but many years ago he wrote a book called Flow, The Psychology of Happiness. And it's the moments when you are engaged, when you're absorbed, those are the moments of happiness. So you can actually train your mind to wander less. It requires regular and dedicated practice in terms of meditation. But in the meantime, you have the option of being more one-pointed in everything you're doing. You can do washing dishes meditation, and cooking meditation, and walking meditation. Essentially, any activity you have, if you can bring all of your awareness to it, you are going to increase a level of satisfaction and a level of happiness. There's a classic story of back in the Buddha's day when one of the benefactors, one of the donors to the Buddha, said, "How is it that everyone practicing what you're teaching seems so happy and so radiant?" And the Buddha says, "Well, we're just sort of present when we're walking, when we're sitting, and when we're cleaning up." And this benefactor said, "Well, but everyone walks around and sits and cleans up." And the Buddha said, "Yes, but how many people are aware when they're sitting, aware when they're walking, and aware when they're cleaning up?" It's so simple, and yet It really is the key. How fully present can you be when you're engaged into activity? And the more present you can be, the more satisfaction and happiness will naturally come out of that. It's a challenging practice because it kind of goes directly against what our culture is all about right now, which is this barrage of information and distraction. So perhaps just a quick little moment of reflection. If you like, you can close your eyes again. And again, just to revisit the power of concentration. You might turn your attention to your breath. Just notice where you feel it the most predominant. And for the next few rounds of breath, how intimately can you track the sensations there? And just sensing the power of simply being present, being one-pointed. And then as you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And you can let the eyes open if you like. So a few things to keep in mind when you look toward increasing your capacity for happiness. One is to remember to do one thing at a time fully. Very simple, not easy to remember. It's helpful to simply notice whether you have assigned happiness to your external conditions. It can be helpful, and I always find that this is where those Buddhist lists come in so handy. You know, those three qualities that always pull you off center. The category of greed, wanting, craving, fantasy, planning. As soon as you notice that the mind is engaged, you have the capacity to bring yourself back. The whole category and subcategories of hatred, aversion, judgment, anger, blame, ill will. If you can recognize the state, there's a possibility you can call yourself back. All the subcategories of delusion, of confusion, kind of sleepiness, fogginess. When you can recognize those states, you can call your attention back. It can also be helpful to look at what you're doing that cultivates happiness. There are certain thoughts, certain emotions that cultivate happiness, to reflect on compassion, kindness, joy. These are the emotions that tend to ignite your capacity for happiness. And in particular, two things. These two things together are one of the most powerful drugs for the brain. Gratitude and appreciation. When you turn your attention to gratitude and appreciation, it's fascinating. One of the interesting things is how when you're feeling grateful, it is a condition that dominates your internal experience. You cannot feel grateful and angry at the same time. So gratitude and appreciation are very, very powerful. But when you have an intention to be happy, when you really look at happiness, inevitably you'll notice how it'll amplify how you're not happy. And that's very helpful to remember. Just as in meditation you have an intention to be present, and you notice in 3D how you're not present, happiness will do the same. I had shared how before how another person and I had created a program, a 7-day retreat called The Art of Joyful Living. And we had all these fantastic things that we were going to do of writing and creative arts and all this stuff. And the saddest people in the world showed up for the program. It's like, of course they would. It's a pretty quick curriculum change. When you have an intention to cultivate happiness, some interesting things can occur. I had an embarrassing experience this Sunday morning. I went down to the river with my boat, as I usually do most mornings, kind of before sunrise. And there were a lot of people there. There was a Cub Scouts camping overnight, and another fellow was kind of loading up his boat at the same time I was. And I've learned something as I'm kind of down on the river a lot, that when you see guys alone, like going fishing, they're usually the most intense introverts in the world. So usually don't say anything because, that whole thing of how can you tell an extroverted engineer from Finland? He looks at your shoes. But there was this one fellow, and again, I smiled, but he didn't smile back, and usually I'm okay with that, but he just had a vibe about him that I didn't, just kind of set me off a little bit. And as we're both sort of like, he was pushing out, one of the scoutmasters said, "So how far upriver do you go?" And I said, "Well, I might go as far as like 2 miles up." And this other guy said, "Well, I go 6 miles up." I thought, really? And I said, "Well, that's impressive." I was trying to be friendly. And then this guy took off, but he just kind of gave me a look, And it just triggered something really immature in me. I'm in pretty good shape. I kayak every day almost. So I just thought, I'm going to see if this guy really is going to go 6 miles. And he was motoring along, but I'm in pretty good shape, even though I had a clunky boat and he had a fast boat. And so, he's motoring along, and then occasionally he would sort of like pause, and then he'd look back, and then he'd start going faster again, which brought up a little pleasant sensations for me. Really, it's so embarrassing. And so, here I am in this like mad race with this stranger going up the Potomac River. And so I got to like the 2 mile point, and he actually was going further up. But then at some point, I looked back once, it was a really beautiful sunrise, but I didn't want to take the time to take a photograph because I didn't want to lose any distance. And at some point I just thought, what am I doing? Like this poor guy is just out for a Sunday morning kayak. Why are we in this testosterone event here? So he kind of got up beyond the rapids, kind of going beyond, and then I noticed he kind of looked back and saw I stopped, and then I could tell he was really tired, And again, it's like, okay, I made my point, But once I realized what I was caught in, this sort of like comparative, judging, competitive, whatever it was, I just paused and I thought, let's see if I can turn this around, Can I just wish this guy well? He's probably a local guy working hard, and this is his morning to go out and have an adventure on the river, and what a rare thing. So I actually turned my attention toward wishing him well. And then once I did that, I could feel just a deep sense of expansion. I think part of it was the endorphins from working out so intensively. But part of it as well was just a sense of well-being. And it completely shifted my experience from being mean-spirited to being a well-wisher of this guy. Here's a quote from the Buddha. All that you are is the result of what you have thought. It is founded on your thoughts. It is made up of your thoughts. If you speak or act with an evil thought, pain follows you, as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the wagon. All that you are is the result of what you have thought. It is founded on your thoughts. It is made up of your thoughts. If you speak or act with a pure thought, happiness follows you like a shadow that never leaves. And that is the difference between basing happiness on external conditions and doing the U-turn to really look closely at the attitude in your mind and to recognize that when you can shift from being self-centered to aware of other, accessing compassion and kindness, a completely different equation begins to emerge. So just a few things in closing. We'll have a little closing meditation. There's a great line I love that says, "Be happy, it'll confuse the heck out of your enemies." But sometimes when I'm meeting someone, they're kind of going through a breakup with a partner. And I usually don't share this until they're kind of over the real grief and shock of it. But it's back to the title of the talk, that happiness is the best revenge. I remember sharing that with someone. And it's not be happy so that you can show up your partner as to how great you are without them and have them, long for you. But it really is a recognition that when you are happy, your life changes dramatically. But also, when those you are in conflict with are happy, their life changes as well. When you think of those with whom you are in conflict, if they were happy, how would they act? Chances are that their self-centeredness, their pettiness would be transformed. That a natural quality of generosity, of ease, of kindness might emerge for them. So there's something quite profound to wish your enemies well, to wish those with whom you have conflict, may they feel happy. Because if they feel happy, this world is in a different realm. Let's close our eyes. We'll just have a short reflection. As you feel the breath, it's an interesting thing to explore how happiness, in some ways, is the result of the absence of other conditions. There are a few ways to explore it. One is simply to sense in this moment, as you feel this breath, in the absence of desire, who are you? In the absence of aversion, what arises? If you were to simply experience this breath, this moment, without desire for this moment to be any different, just sense what that feels like inside. And you might, in your final moments, just bring into mind those who are the very closest to you, those in your tight little inner circle. And wish these beings well. See, imagine, wish them their capacity to access happiness. And imagine that radiance flowing through them. Those you work with, those you live with, may these beings feel happy. And those with whom you may have some conflict, some grudge, you might even imagine them happy, wish them happy. And in your own way, let that wish of happiness extend out in all directions to all beings. May all feel happy. And we'll close by offering this wish of happiness to yourself. Imagine your capacity for happiness deepening, widening. And imagine you could offer the fruit of your inner happiness to be a benefit to all. And when you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And as you're ready, you can let your eyes open.